Good evening. Canada's Conservative government is going to deliver on one major campaign promise at least, because 11 years after the abolition of capital punishment and 24 years since the last hanging, there is a motion in the House of Commons to give approval to the restoration of the death penalty. Now, whether or not you're going to be influenced or whether or not there are any new arguments in this particular issue, I have here tonight three men of strong opinions and much knowledge. And the first I would like you to meet tonight is Ezzat Fattah, professor, criminologist, Fraser University. The second is David Ricardo Williams, lawyer, historian, and adjunct professor in the law school at UVic.
Correct.
And thirdly, but not by any means lastly, is Michael Jackson, distinguished lawyer from UBC. Difficult things these to handle. I don't want them to scream at each other all the time. We're going to do it as in a professorial tutorial to begin with. Now, Professor Fattah, faced as the public now is with a moral decision and knowing that at least 70% of all Canadians want to see the rope, what is your case? Are you for or against it?
I am against it, Jack. And I honestly don't know what we are doing debating this issue again now. I had thought that we have put it behind us. All the predictions, the prophecies of doom and gloom that were made during the last parliamentary debate by those who were opposing the abolition of the death penalty have been proven wrong. They have been proven wrong on every count. And this goes against a resolution of the United Nations and the trend in most countries of the civilized world. Let me explain. A resolution of the United Nations adopted by the General Assembly in 1971 called upon member countries that have abolished the death penalty not to restore it. Now, Western Europe, with the exception of Turkey, and Turkey even hasn't had executions for some years now, but all of Western Europe is abolitionist territory, either de jure or de facto. Not only this, but some countries such as Holland, Spain, even the Philippines in its new constitution and Nicaragua in its new constitution have entrenched the principle of the abolition of the death penalty in their constitution in order to ensure that no government can bring it back. So what are we doing now here in Canada after 25 years free of executions, after 10 years of legal abolition, with our criminal homicide rate going down, with our crime situation much, much better than the situation in the United States, debating and wasting valuable time of debate time in the House of Commons in Canada, debating whether we should go back to hanging or not.
Well, that's a why. It's a political why, too. But I think we must have a change of flavor here and go to David Williams. Now, David, unless you've changed radically since the last time we talked about this, your view has no place in it for that of Professor Fattah.
Absolutely, Jack. My views have not changed. If anything, they've solidified. I happen to think, to start with, I don't think there's any point to be gained in comparing the Canadian experience to those of other countries, particularly the United States. Our social conditions are different, our backgrounds are different, and what may be right for Canada may be wrong for somebody else. The question is the restoration of the death penalty appropriate for Canada? Now, I'm not hung up on statistics. You can argue statistics endlessly and on the deterrent factor. I'm not so much caught up with that. What I feel as a citizen of this country is that there are rules in this society which have to be abided by. We come into this society, we have to abide by them. One of the fundamental rules to me is that if you deliberately plan the taking of somebody else's life, you have put your own life at risk and have forfeited it. And in the planned and deliberate killing, a killing during the course of serious crime like a sexual assault, as it's now called. Why we've given up on good old rape, I don't know, because rape is horrible when instead of watering down the phrase of sexual assault.
State to the point, though.
If you commit a murder during the course of that type of offense, or armed robbery, or you deliberately plan the killing of somebody, in my view, the rules of society have required you to forfeit your own life, and the death penalty should be applied. Now, the death penalty, not necessarily the rope or the noose. The legislation before the House of Commons makes no mention about what form a death penalty will take. And I happen to think that we should abolish the noose, but I don't think we should abolish the death penalty.
So therefore we can put David Williams down quite clearly as one who favors execution by the state for premeditated murder of almost any kind.
Yes.
How about you, Michael Jackson? Now, I don't know where you stand, Michael, exactly. I remember the last time you were a little bit on edge about some things, but give me your professorial opinion with all your experience.
I think it's a professorial opinion. I think it's also a personal opinion. It's also, I think, an opinion which hopefully is informed by an understanding of Canadian law. I think David's right. We have to look at the Canadian context for this decision. As I understand the argument for capital punishment, it's moved beyond the argument based upon deterrence. I think the statistics and all the accumulated evidence is very clear that the death penalty does not deter. As I understand David's position and that of many people in this country, the argument for the death penalty is that there are some crimes which are so horrible, to which we have such revulsion, that no lesser sanction effectively expresses the condemnation of society. And that not so much from the point of view of vengeance, but from the point of view of just deserts, a life should be forfeited in order to restore the balance. Now, if that is the essence of people's position, I think there are some problems with it, not so much in terms of the principle, and I have some views on the principle, but there are problems in terms of how do we determine who, in fact, deserves capital punishment? What are the categories of condemnation? David's talked about planned and deliberate murders. He's also talked about the deliberate killing in an armed robbery. No doubt the police chiefs would say any killing of a police officer. The prison wardens have their list of killings involving prison officials. Other individuals regard a killing of a young child, even if it's not premeditated, as something so offensive that should be in the list. In other words, there is a long category, and in that category are a whole bunch of cases which are not the same. One of the problems I have is that the restoration of capital punishment in principle will bring in its train incremental additions once we've breached the threshold of principle. There's a second point I want to make, and that has to do with how capital punishment is applied in the context of Canadian criminal law. David talks about the idea of a killing during the course of an armed robbery. Under contemporary Canadian law, someone who sits in a car while his buddy goes into a bank to do a robbery, even though he has been told, I don't have a gun, I won't use a gun, if in fact a gun is used and death results, the man in the car, or the woman in the car, will in fact be convicted of a murder.
You are splitting here, though. You're talking about the famous case in Britain on the rooftop, with a man in police custody who couldn't fire the gun while somebody else fired and killed, and they both hanged.
Well, that's one example, but there are many examples in Canadian law in which the public's idea of the murderer bears no reasonable reference to what, in fact, the law's definition of a murderer is.
All right.
And that's something the public does not understand, that you don't, in fact, have to have an intention to kill to be convicted of murder, even first-degree murder in this country.
We know where David stands. He's for premeditated murder of serious offences, hang them. Do you stand the same way?
No.
Oh. You, of course, think it is uncivilized and a step backward into the Dark Ages to use capital punishment no matter how gruesome the killing was.
That is correct, Jack, and I am opposed to capital punishment on moral, philosophical, criminological and penological
But
grounds.
not on deterrent grounds.
Not on, one of the grounds is that it is not a unique deterrent, as many of its proponents used to claim it is.
Good. We have a good basis for discussion here before we let you join in after the break. Gentlemen, Professor Fattah, David Williams, and Michael Jackson, surely there is an element involved in this debate which might see you lose the battle, in that, forgive me, the public by the polls wants an element of retribution and perhaps vengeance. What's wrong with that?
Well, let me address myself first to the argument of retribution or vengeance, and then to the argument about public opinion. I don't think that in the 20th century, close to the end of the 20th century, the state should be in the business of killing people, should institutionalize murder. Plato, almost 2,500 years ago, said that nobody inflicts punishment for the sake of punishment unless he is blinded by vengeance, because you cannot undo what has been done. This was reiterated by Beccaria more than 200 years ago.
But neither of these gentlemen are running for office now and trying to please the voters.
That's correct.
Neither Plato nor the other gentlemen of whom I have never heard, if you'll forgive me.
I thought that we cannot now argue for infliction of punishment for the sake of punishment, for the sake of vengeance or retribution. That punishment has to have some utilitarian purpose, some utilitarian goal. And usually the goal that was advocated for the death penalty was its deterrent effect. Now, with this deterrent effect being proven very shaky, the argument has shifted to from deterrence to retribution.
Well, now, gentlemen, Michael.
Well, may I say, if we are not to have capital punishment in some form, regardless of the method of execution. If we are not
forget the method now. One method is just as gruesome as another method.
No, it's not. Lethal injection.
Who's going to give the lethal objection? They become a murderer.
Well, you're retired.
Changing the method of execution does not change
do
the inherent cruelty and barbarity
let the
of
prisoner
death
himself
penalty.
do so. My alternative is this, and this would meet the objections of those who are concerned that an innocent person may be executed, although the demonstrable cases of such things are very, very rare, is this. For premeditated murder and the other forms of murder I've described, let them serve life forever, forever.
Oh, you're backing away now,
No, but I would accept this as a compromise position and some serious debate on the issue. If we cannot have capital punishment, then for goodness sakes, let us have life imprisonment that means what it says. And if, say, a prisoner after a certain number of years, or after any time from the commencement of his incarceration, says, I'm fed up with this, I want to end it, let him be executed.
Just before
That's more barbarous, is it not?
Not at all.
Before discussing the alternative, I think we should discuss the principle itself. And what I am saying is that I find it totally illogical to say to someone and to society at large, we are killing you because thou shalt not kill, because killing is wrong. It seems to me totally irrational that in order to denounce an act, the state imitates the same act. It does not seem to be a sensible way of educating people about the sanctity of human life.
Let me say something about retribution, because I think to the extent the death debate is premised on whether retribution is appropriate or not is a false premise.
You call this the death debate?
The death debate. The retribution, if properly understood, is a perfectly sensible and reasonable approach. It requires that people who commit crime receive their just deserts. The question here is really one of justice. What is the just deserts for someone who has committed certain forms of the most heinous kinds of murder? And it seems to me that in all other crimes, retribution is part of the sentence. There's nothing logical about the argument that murder has to be visited with death in order for there to be just retribution.
No, just a minute. I don't quite get that. There's nothing logical about the argument that justice has to be...
That the death penalty has to be the penalty for murder. Ezzat has made this point. We do not require that people who commit sexual assault be themselves sexually assaulted. I mean, the whole criminal justice system is premised upon the idea of trying to weigh the gravity of an offence and create a hierarchy of punishments which reflect the gravity. And life imprisonment seems to me a perfectly appropriate response which does not have any of the implications of the death penalty.
Now, that's your position, therefore, that you would accept life imprisonment instead of the death penalty in the most gruesome killing.
That's right. Let me tell you
Forever?
why.
Forever?
Forever?
Without hope of parole or mandatory supervision?
No, because
well,
it seems to me...
They'll be different, then you don't really accept it then.
Well,
what I am saying is that if we can't, again, at risk of repetition, if we cannot have capital punishment, then for goodness sakes, let us have life imprisonment,
well,
and without hope of parole, without mandatory supervision, without anything.
Okay,
that's not the debate. That's
natural life.
The debate is capital punishment or not capital punishment.
That's right.
You're against it.
I'm against it. And let me tell you one of the... I've said at the beginning, there are some personal, professional reasons. I am involved in a number of cases, one of which is presently before the Ministry of Justice, of a young man who, at the age of 18, was charged and convicted of murder. He was originally charged with first-degree murder. The murder originated in a prison. In fact, it was another prisoner. It could have been a prison guard. That young man could well have been convicted of a hanging offence. At this particular point, there is enough evidence to raise the most serious concerns about his innocence. Now, had hanging been permissible, I would not be investigating this case. The Ministry of Justice would not be looking at it. Members of the parole board, who are pretty hard-nosed, would not be convinced that they are dealing with an innocent man. Now, you may say that's rare. The question is, how many cases like that do we need before people are prepared to say the fact that they will feel better because some people are hanged as opposed to serving life in prison?
Is that part of your argument, or is your argument cleaner and more virginal than that? You do not believe that the possibility of a miscarriage would put you against the death penalty?
Well, I have so many arguments, not one single argument, Jack, and the irreversibility, irrevocability of the death penalty is just one of them. And we have so many cases, documented cases, both in Canada and in the United States, about judicial errors that have taken place.
We cannot draw comparisons. We cannot draw
How about the case of Donald Marshall in Canada?
That probably is the one demonstrable case.
What about
in this
the Coffin
century.
case?
No, the Coffin case, the man was guilty. I know about it. I've investigated the case. I've written about it.
There is one point I would like to make here, and that is the public at large and most of people who debate the issue of the death penalty, they have a very narrow conception of what constitutes a judicial error. In their mind, judicial error is only when an innocent person has been convicted, sentenced to death, and is hanged.
Is that not correct?
Not correct at all.
You mean the jury made the wrong decision?
The wrong decision can be done if there is a mitigating circumstance, and this is not recognized by the jury.
All right,
or by the
gentlemen, let me put some simple man-in-the-street questions to you. I mean, you're all terribly esoteric and learned in every way. If the death penalty returned, is it not a fact that the rich would get off and the poor would hang because the rich could afford the fancy lawyers and all the trial?
No.
Discrimination is inherent in the application of the death penalty.
All the evidence I've seen in other jurisdictions and in Canada suggests that the death penalty is applied discriminatorily against the poor, the disadvantaged, and those who, in fact, do not have access to the resources the three of us have access to.
If a rich man steals a loaf of bread, he will certainly go to jail if he ever has to, and he's convicted. Next question.
But I haven't answered the question. The first question, Jack. No, I haven't. No, I haven't. Peter Demeter, who was convicted of the murder of his wife in Toronto, the famous Demeter case, had the best lawyers and criminal lawyers in Canada. He was convicted. even though he spent huge sums of money.
Doesn't prove the case.
But that's the question you asked. If a rich man can afford a good lawyer, will he get off on a charge of
the likelihood?
Herman Buxbaum had Greenspan acting for him, didn't do him any good.
Can you tell us about
he was convicted?
Any millionaire who has been hanged in the history of capital punishment in Canada? Do you have any names about millionaires?
Next question.
I don't have the establishment rules.
If the death penalty were returned, would it not influence jurors against bringing in a guilty verdict?
I think this has been proven empirically, and there are so many studies that show
He says yes. What about you?
The studies are clear. Since 1976, the number of first-degree convictions has gone up dramatically, while the number of murders has remained constant. That, I think, is because of the...
Gentlemen, one more session with us, and then we'll go to the phones after the break. Each of these gentlemen has a point they want to amplify a little bit. But first of all, I want to get a simple answer to a simple question. Would you go along with life plus a day instead of hanging? Simple, yes or no?
I don't know what it means. What is life plus a day?
It means the day after you're dead, you leave the jail if you're convicted.
Oh, I see what you mean. Would I go merely as a compromise? I'm in favor of capital punishment.
Would you?
But I would compromise on that.
I could envisage some crimes which are so heinous, and I think we all probably have a common agenda in relation to a multiple child murderer, where I think life without any possibility of release is an appropriate sentence.
Now we come to the distinguished criminologist who probably supports the present 25 years with a potential review at 15.
Well, I opposed this at the time, Jack, because it went against a recommendation made by the Law Reform Commission of Canada. The Law Reform Commission of Canada explicitly said that no prison sentence should exceed 20 years. But in 1976, this was seen as an acceptable alternative with the emotions running high against the abolition of the death penalty. The government thought that it can get more votes by having this as the alternative.
Another point. You wanted to define murder. Now, why? Murder is murder. There are murders of various degrees.
I think that's one of the most misunderstood concepts in the criminal law. One would have thought and hoped that murder would be relatively simple. Most people have in their mind a model of the murderer, someone who intends to kill, who sacrifices another life subordinate to his own purposes, whether it's emotional or commercial or whatever, robbing a bank or getting rid of a romantic rival. In fact, the law of murder in Canada is the most draconian in the Western world. You do not have to have an intention to kill in order to be convicted of a first-degree murder.
But you wouldn't be hanged for that under any new system.
There's no guarantee at all you would not. For example, let's assume the new system required and permitted hanging for the killing of a police officer in the course of his duties. There is a recent decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal which says that you can be convicted of first-degree murder even though you do not know that the victim is a police officer. Now, that is the contemporary law of Canada according to the Ontario Court of Appeal. Now,
that can be clarified.
I simply don't believe that the Ontario Court of Appeal has said that you can be guilty without actually knowing. I mean, the whole basis of the killing of a police officer is that you know that he's a judicial, a law enforcement official.
Well, let me just read you from Martin's Criminal Code.
Well, then the case is probably under appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada.
But not only this, but all classifications of murder are arbitrary.
Arbitrary?
Yes, arbitrary.
But let me tell you what the public wants. The public, according to the polls, wants 1, killing for all premeditated contract murders, right? 2, killing for a policeman in the execution of his duty being shot, or a prison guard being killed by a second-time killer, right? Isn't that one of the big demands?
Yes, I think so.
And 3, what would the third one be? Terrorism.
Terrorism, right. Now, Jack, you asked me about the polls.
You in fact also mentioned killing in the course of a sexual assault or armed robbery.
Yes, armed robbery.
But you wouldn't go for ordinary killing,
no, not at all. But if you're holding up a storekeeper, as happened in Montreal last night, and you kill him, then you should hang or be executed.
What about if you're sitting outside waiting for your buddy to come
The
out of the
getaway
car.
Should you be hanged
as
too?
well?
No, I must say, Michael, I agree with you that I look upon the person that should be executed as the one who is directly responsible for it. Now, you mentioned the draconian laws that we have in this country. I agree with you; they are somewhat convoluted. But there is now underway a discussion paper by which the criminal law of the country might be amended, and perhaps Ezzat would approve of it because he thinks that we should be ruled by law reform commissions, apparently, in defining the period of parole. There is now under review a very much simplified criminal code, which would simply use, as I understand it, simply the word murder, leaving it to the courts.
You're losing me.
No, well, I'm replying to Michael here.
Once you start
Jack.
trying to single out certain offenses in the course of which killing would be a first degree, then we enter or come back again to this arbitrariness. Once you try to single out certain categories of victims, the killing of which would be classified as first degree
Well,
murder,
a serial
you
killer
come
of
to the
children,
arbitrariness.
a serial killer of children who is not insane, who is not.
I am glad you
insane.
mentioned this word insane because it brings me back to what I was trying to explain about what constitutes a judicial error. For example, if a person is suffering from some mental disorder or some mental illness and is declared by the psychiatrist as fully sane, and this is accepted by the court, this is a judicial error. On the other hand, if the person is sane and is declared insane, this is also a judicial error.
We're all agreed that we could not in any circumstances, even if the rope comes back, or some form of death.
Even some form of death, Jack.
When we have the death penalty, we are placing the right of life and death in the hands of psychiatrists, and we all know how inexact the science of psychiatry is.
Or criminologists, perhaps.
It seems to me, and I've thought about this, long and hard, that given even the lack of consensus amongst us as to what categories you would put the most offensive type of murder into, given the fact that the law of murder itself is unclear and the Law Reform Commission itself is recommending a tremendous and fresh overview of the whole thing, is it not premature to start thinking about capital punishment when we don't even know what should be defined as murder?
If the House of Commons does pass this motion, a 15-member committee will cross the country to take public opinion and then produce within 90 days draft legislation to amend the criminal code.
Why would the opinion of this committee be better than the opinion of the Royal Commission in Britain that recommended very strongly against attempting these arbitrary classifications of murder? Not only does the death penalty increase the number of acquittals, it also increases the number of insanity pleas.
Right. Now, one thing I didn't get from you, though, in the most gross kind of murder, do you think it should be life plus a day?
No, I never said that. I said always that the discussion of what is the suitable alternative should be separated from the discussion of whether we should have or we should not have the death penalty.
You would go for a natural life and a certain types of murder.
There are very few, but I can envisage some.
And you want a different kind of death.
Yes, and Jack, moreover, not only life, but life in the general prison population.
Oh, no, that is evil.
No, it's not evil.
Jack,
you hear what he said?
Well, that's another form of capital punishment, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Well, then fine. If we're prepared, if a society is prepared to abdicate what I consider its responsibility,
you would leave it to the other
and allow the prisoners to do it, then that's a shocking commentary upon our fortitude.
But you said that. You advocated in the general population. That
Absolutely.
Means if one prisoner kills a certain type, he's got to be hanged too?
I suggested a little while ago that a man
He cannot be serious. But let me say this, that the decision on what is the suitable alternative to the death penalty depends on what is the purpose of our criminal law. Why are we punishing people? For what purpose? That is the key issue. That is the key question.
Give me the standard speech.
Is it retribution? Is it rehabilitation? Is it treatment? What is it?
It's protection of society in the first instance.
Well, protection of society can be achieved without necessarily life
and rehabilitation,
imprisonment.
secondly.
Well, rehabilitation, I think, has fallen down
why
to probably a low fourth at this point.
Why in advance or why a priori set and say, well, life imprisonment without possibility of parole?
I mean, one of the things at the moment, in terms of our present life sentence is a life sentence. You have the possibility of parole after 25 years. There are people who, in fact, will not get out after 25 years. There, the parole board is looking at their continuing dangerousness. And if, in fact, they continue to be dangerous after 25 years, a life sentence can be life plus a day.
Before we go to the phones, Ezzat Fattah from SFU is an abolitionist in extreme, because to be anything but is a mark of savagery.
That is correct.
Right. You, sir, too, are an abolitionist most of the way.
I'm an abolitionist all of the way because of the politics and practicalities of implementing capital punishment other than in an arbitrary, discriminatory, and potentially mistaken way.
When you're a man and want a pound of flesh for certain designated serious killing.
That's right.
After the break, your calls. Reintroduce my panel, I think. Ezzat Fattah from SFU, David Williams from, not Victoria, from Duncan, and Michael Jackson from UBC. Go ahead, please.
Hi there, Jack.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what, if a person, it doesn't matter to me, I'm all for capital punishment, I must say that right now. If a person takes another life, be it in an armed robbery or whatever, why should the Canadian public be forced to pay tens or whatever thousands of dollars it costs per year to keep, say, an Annie Bruce or
Clifford Olson.
Yeah, Clifford Olson.
Okay, there's the old money question. To you first, Ezzat.
I don't think that when a human life is being discussed that economic arguments or the matter of dollars and cents should be involved. But let me answer this argument. We have many studies that have been done that showed that it is more economic to keep people for the rest of their lives in a prison or a penitentiary than to go through the process of executing them.
Michael?
That argument would justify the death penalty or severe mutilation or other kinds of physical punishment as opposed to in prison for almost any offense.
I agree with the caller, Jack. I think they should all be in the prison population. And it's interesting, did you notice just last week that Olson made an unsuccessful application to the court to be returned to the prison population on the grounds that his confinement in solitary confinement was cruel and unusual punishment?
We've had a number of decisions about that from the courts.
This is a widely held but very wrong belief that it is less costly to the taxpayers to execute people than to keep them in prison.
I find it hard to believe.
Well,
the cost
a
of
very
these
recent
people
study in New York State found that it costs 1.8 million more
to execute somebody.
To execute someone, and this means because of the long trial process.
Oh, that's the American experience. Again, you keep coming back to the American experience.
It's not the American experience. There is no reason to think that it would cost less.
Different from us.
Well, we have also a Supreme Court here, and we have a Court of Appeal.
And we have a Charter of Rights by which anybody can go anywhere, anytime to make any
save
application.
us, but that'll be another topic for another program. God save us from the Charter of Rights.
Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please.
Yes, actually, I got 2 points to make. First of all, I'm for capital punishment, but I do not believe it's a deterrent. I think the deterrent factor should not take place in that. If we use the measure of deterrence, you can look at traffic violation tickets. The people that get tickets, they get them all the time. Are we going to suddenly stop giving out tickets because people are still violating the traffic section? And people that go to jail.
Michael, matter of fact,
it's a very touchy question. Before coming here, they towed my car at UBC because I hadn't paid my traffic ticket. So, and they told me they were going to do that, and it didn't deter. They told me
towed your car from UBC because you had
not paid my traffic tickets, and they told me they were going to do it, and it still didn't get me to pay the ticket. So much for deterrence.
Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Mr. Webster, I'm glad to see you always bringing both sides of the thing, of the arguments. I'm in favor of the death penalty. Let me just say briefly to Mr. Fattah what I'm thinking of. There's too much hypocrisy. We think nothing of allowing the Americans to test cruise missiles, which is a killer. We think nothing of allowing smoking, which is a killer. And this just indicates to me too much hypocrisy. We've killed thousands in wars, yet we fight and argue hours, weeks, months about keeping the Olsons alive. And I have not heard one word from any of the criminologists or the people who are against hanging about what to do about the victims, how to help them.
Well, it is also a hypocrisy to say, well, we will have the death penalty, but we will use a more humane or a painless method of execution. So that is hypocritical, because changing the method of execution does not change the inherent cruelty and savagery of the death penalty. Now, about the argument of victims, I'm glad that the caller brought it up, because it is now the argument that is becoming the dominant, or it's taking the forefront rather than deterrence. This argument about the victim, those who claim that they support the death penalty because of their concern for the victim's relatives, the victim's family, the victim's friends, the victim's neighbors, show total indifference to the pain and suffering of another innocent family, the family of the person who is going to be executed.
He's drawing the long bow.
That's a very
well,
long
execution
bow,
does not relieve the suffering of the family of the victim. It creates new victims. It doubles the suffering. What society should be doing is not to nurture the feelings of vindictiveness and retaliation, but the feelings of forgiveness and reconciliation.
We're not a perfect society. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Fattah. Dr. Fattah, I'd like to know what you would call correct retribution on a case like Clifford Olson. I would like to know what, if you call us your future, how are you going to protect us?
Well, I didn't call for retribution. I mentioned that our claim to civilization is based on the fact that we have gone beyond the talion law, beyond an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and life for a life. You know Jacques Dostoevsky, he said, the degree of a civilization of a society can be measured by the way it treats its criminals. And I am very surprised that the Canadian public that would look upon the practice of cutting the hand of the thief, or cutting the tongue of the perjurer, or looking upon other bodily mutilations as uncivilized, and still cutting the head is seen as perfectly acceptable, civilized practice.
I can give you a logical answer to that. In Saudi Arabia, whatever it is, they chop off the hand, it's because the hand committed the offense, right? They stole something.
Yes.
If you hang as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, I think many civilizations would still accept that, would they not?
I don't think so. It is another paradox that people who would condemn torture, if it is committed in Chile or in the Soviet Union or other countries, would accept or condone the ultimate form of torture, that is putting someone to death in cold blood and paying for it.
Well, now, you agreed with him on that. No cold blood.
No, but the thing is, it's really interesting, the number of callers who come back to Clifford Olson. It's as if, and I think this is a genuine thing, that the crimes committed in that case are so repulsive, are so horrible, they go so far beyond that which any of us can imagine, that I myself, even though I've been an abolitionist for a long time, if I could think that the only person who would be hanged was people like Clifford Olson, even though I'd have great problems, I probably could be convinced. The real issue is that is not where the debate ends. Once you have breached this wall against capital punishment, Clifford Olson is number one. We have number 2, number 3, number 4, and in the end we get capital punishment for a whole range of people whose crimes do not have the depravity of Clifford Olson.
But Clifford Olson, the view of this caller and the view of the people who talk about the victims, this reflects the outrage of society towards this type of offense. And it is, society demands that something be done about people like Olson, as the caller suggests.
Yes,
and he should unquestionably be put away. You were asked directly by one caller, Dr. Fattah, what you would have done with Olson. And incidentally, Jack, so long as the outrage of the community as a whole reflects itself in cases like Olson, you asked earlier, would juries be likely to convict people? With 73% of the people in Canada now favoring capital punishment, apparently, there's not going to be any difficulty about getting convictions of murder from juries. And particularly in cases like Olson, which just, you know, just it's revolting.
But what does Olson have to do with a young man who, I'm giving you an example of a first-degree murder case I know, which could be a capital murder case, of a young man who's 17 years old, who hitches a ride with a view to rob the person. He pulls a gun, let me finish, he pulls a gun on the individual. The individual turns out to be a plainclothes police officer who tells him to put the gun away and not be stupid. He threatens the man makes a grab for the gun goes off, and the man is killed. That, under Canadian law, is murder in the first degree.
And rightly
Given
so.
that it's a police officer, it's
And
capital
rightly
murder.
so.
Is that 17-year-old demonstrate the same moral depravity as
Gentlemen,
Clifford Olson? I don't think so.
Good point. No, he hasn't. I mean, I go along with you on that, too. Many people have said if they had the chance to kill Olson, they'd do it themselves.
Sure.
You'd put him in the prison population.
Yes.
Would you,
Sure.
you would hang that man, that second man I've given, would you, though?
Oh, yes, certainly.
Okay, after the break.
That's...
Reintroduce my panel. We've been very bright and informative and disagree on occasions. Ezzat Fattah from SFU, Michael Jackson from UBC, and David Williams from Duncan. Now, from Nanaimo. Go ahead, please.
Hello. Yeah, there is, this is to Mr. Fattah. He was talking about alternative rehabilitation to a person who has killed or whatever. But I figure there is no alternative rehabilitation to a person who has killed or raped a child. I'm speaking as a parent. I cannot see how somebody who would kill or rape a 3-year-old child, as in the case of the kid up in Kamloops that got killed, it's just, there can be no alternative rehabilitation to somebody who could kill or rape a child.
Well, your answers are predictable. You say no capital punishment regardless.
No capital punishment regardless. You see, Jack, in criminology, it is a very simple question. Are criminals born or are they society-made? If the answer is that they are born, then you can't turn around and hold them responsible for something that they had nothing to do with, and you cannot then execute them. If they are society-made, then society cannot turn around and just discharge its own responsibility.
I've got a different response
Michael?
to that. I saw a film the other night called The Mission, which depicts a man who was a killer of Indian men, women, and children, who, as far as I know, it's based upon a true story, became a Jesuit priest and died protecting Indian men, women, and children. Now, without suggesting that every killer has within him the sort of the renaissance of
rebirth
De Niro in The Mission, it seems to me that as a society we do subscribe to the fact that people can change, and we either have some faith in that or we don't. I happen to have faith in that. I have seen men in prison who at one point in their life were depraved, who were vicious, who were thugs, who after 10 years are none of those things.
Obviously, society shapes us all, but if a man, we have free will as well in society, and if a man chooses to exercise free will by killing somebody, then that's game over for him as far as I'm concerned.
Well, if you believe in free will, then you believe in the reformability of mankind.
No,
and,
no, not at all.
Not in these circumstances.
Not in these circumstances.
Because if it is, if their behavior is determined,
you've made your bed and you've got to lie in it.
Go ahead from Taylor, BC.
Yeah, hello. Earlier the professor had mentioned that God said, "You shall not murder." Exactly one chapter later, he says, if a man schemes and kills another man deliberately, take him away from my altar and put him to death.
That must be the Old
His
Testament.
father and mother put him to death.
well, I don't think we
Kidnaps
should.
put him to death. If you're going to argue about the death penalty, you're going to have to argue with God, because he put him to death.
I think the religious arguments have been put to rest now with all the churches in Canada taking a firm position, firm stand against the death penalty.
But their parishioners have not. The church leaders, but presumably amongst the 73% of people who we are told favor return.
That is what is lacking.
Presumably many of these are parishioners.
That is what is lacking in Canada, as in some other countries.
You have the same phenomenon in the political parties, where the leaders of the parties,
coming from the leaders of the church,
the leaders of the parties are in favor of there are abolitionists like yourself, but their constituents are not. Are we going to be ruled by the leaders, or are we going to be ruled by the ground roots?
Give me the quote from Edmund Burke, please, Michael. The parliamentary quote. Who was the guy who said you...
Politicians are elected to be representatives. They're not meant to simply vote
the wishes of their constituents.
That's quite
right.
In a sense, that's the whole basis of our democracy is based upon sending people to Parliament who are thoughtful.
Their own conscience.
That's right.
Who have moral courage and political courage, and who can stand and be counted, and who can occasionally go against the will of their constituents.
I suppose if the Tories bring in capital punishment, we're stuck with it for a long while, aren't we?
Well, we're stuck from it probably as long as we've got the Tory government.
Yes. Who knows? It was abolished by a Liberal government in 1976, and what would happen? Who knows?
Let's take some more calls. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Jack. Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
I'm in support of the death penalty. I do believe, though, that the form it should take would be to put these people into the organ banks. They'd save far more lives than whatever they took.
Thank you. No comment necessary. We're not about to carve up convicted criminals and use them in organ banks, are we? Not even
me.
Not even you. Go ahead, please. Hello.
Jack?
That's you.
Yeah, Dr. Fattah. How can he live with himself with young children being raped and murdered, and this going on in a permissive society where people are allowed to carry knives and everything like that? And my second question is, I do not agree with him. Economically speaking, this country we live in cannot afford to keep all these people in jail. We should, if they commit murder and rape children, they should not have the right to breathe our air.
Thank you.
Well, I don't think that society should imitate the act it is denouncing. Society should not sink to the same level to which the murderer has sunk. I would like just to quote to you the former Minister of Justice in Sweden, who said, "The treatment of a criminal should not be designed according to what appears to be worthy of the individual in question. It should be worthy of society itself."
Go ahead, please.
Jack, the intellectuals, the politicians, all of them, they go on and on and on around the circle. Let the people who pay the taxes tell the government what they want. And believe me, the people of this country know what they want, and they will tell the government.
Thank you. That's probably quite an appropriate ending. My time is up, gentlemen. My thanks to Ezzat Fattah, Michael Jackson, and to David Williams.
Thank you, Jack.
An informative and enlightening session. Grateful to you. I'll be back after the break.
Portable Bravo 19, sir. Info, we got a B&E in progress in Zone 3.
Another story of crime tomorrow night, not so deadly, however. 6,000 B&Es in Surrey last year, and we're going to have Alderman Bonnie Schrenk here to tell us what is not being done about it from her point of view, and Claire Culhane too, at 5 p.m. precisely.